Hello, my name's David Goldsborough. I'm a local preacher in training in Christchurch in Ilkley. Thank you for joining me wherever you are and whenever. This week I want to talk a little bit about what we were thinking about at Christchurch last Sunday, which was the second Sunday in Lent. And for the previous two Sundays, we've been looking at probably quite striking events in the life of Jesus as depicted in Mark's Gospel. Two striking events with very, very strong visual imagery. They're called the Transfiguration and also the Baptism of Jesus. And this week we're looking at what is often thought of as being really a pivotal passage in Mark's Gospel, when Jesus for the first time talks about how he is going to undergo suffering, how he's going to die and to come back to life. Challenging thoughts indeed, very challenging for those listening at the time. And all of these, I think, actually have almost centrally a question that we're asking ourselves is, who is this Jesus? I think those at the time listening to him were certainly asking that, and we have continued perhaps to ask that in our individual journeys of faith over the subsequent 2 millennia. So the passage is in Mark's Gospel, and events leading up to it show Jesus teaching and preaching, yes, certainly, but also performing various, perhaps quite well-known miracles. So this is clearly a special individual, not just your ordinary itinerant preacher of the time in that first century AD. And indeed, in the passage immediately before the events that we're looking at, Jesus has been asking his disciples who they think he is. And Peter, one of his ardent disciples, says that he thinks he's the Messiah. This is the person that people at the time had been waiting many, many years to save them from what they thought was, and indeed was, brutal rule, Roman rule at the time. So it's the context of this idea of this very special individual that the reading we're looking at today. And it's from Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, starting at the 31st verse. And in the Good News Bible version, it's entitled, Jesus Speaks About His Suffering and Death. So it goes on, then Jesus began to teach his disciples, the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. He will be put to death, but 3 days later he will rise to life. He made this very clear to them. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus turned around, looked at his disciples, and rebuked Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. Your thoughts don't come from God, but from human nature. Then Jesus called the crowd and his disciples to him. If any of you want to come with me, he told them, you must forget yourself, carry your cross, and follow me. For if you want to save your own life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for me and for the gospel, you will save it. Do you gain anything if you win the whole world but lose your life? Of course not. There is nothing you can give to regain your life. If you are ashamed of me and of my teaching in this godless and wicked day, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of you when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So those who think about these things regard this as being a pivotal part of Mark's Gospel, because this is the first time that Jesus talks of his forthcoming suffering and death and indeed resurrection. And that is in context of the teaching and preaching and the idea that is becoming clear of just how special this individual is. So perhaps we might just take a minute or two just to try and put ourselves in the places of those who are listening to him at the time. So he appears to be a special individual performing these miracles. And it all seems to be going very well because the crowds are flocking to him. He is very, very popular. So would we have argued, as Peter did, when Jesus began to talk about his suffering and death? Surely that can't be right. Surely we also would have perhaps even rebuked Jesus as Peter did. And then when Jesus comes back to Peter, describing himself as Satan, saying these words do not come from God, they come from man, would we have been taken aback, to put it mildly, much as Peter would have been at the time? And with Jesus talking about carrying a cross, about the suffering, when everything seemed to be going so well, how would that have challenged us if we were listening at the time? And Jesus also talks about what use is it to gain the whole world if you lose your life? Perhaps those following him at the time might have thought they were just about to do that, to gain the whole world. This was the Messiah that was going to save them from the troubled and difficult times that they were experiencing under brutal Roman rule. So just simply thinking about these things, just a little bit of context of when this gospel was written. Because although the events that it describes would likely have occurred around about 30 AD, the gospel wasn't written until about 30 or 40 years later. So it is looking back. It is what's described as being taking a post-Easter perspective. And there certainly is some debate as to why the author of Mark's gospel might have written of these events as he did. Because when the gospel was written, it was still uncomfortable and difficult times. But whatever the reason it was written as it was, there appears to be little, if anything, of comfort in the words that Jesus has used. So Mark is writing as a post-Easter community, but he's writing for his community at the time and in the place. So what of our post-Easter look back to these events and to what Jesus has said many, many years later? Well, to me, the questions that are posed by this passage are, well, they're deeply personal. And the deeply personal questions of faith that at this time of year of Lent, many Christians, if not most Christians, will be wrestling with. And they talk of suffering and they talk of death. Perhaps our communities here in Britain, in light of our experience of the pandemic over the last year now, that will resonate, those difficult questions of how we face those times of suffering. Physical, yes, but emotional and spiritual as well. And perhaps when Jesus asked the question, what use is it to gain the whole world if you lose your life? You might find yourself reflecting that current society would appear to be trying to gain the whole world. If you think in terms of the gross inequalities of income across our own society, but also across the world as a whole, it would seem that there are those who would wish to gain the whole world at the expense of others, and surely we would examine perhaps our own thoughts and feelings about that. And perhaps we might reflect on the other great crisis that faces us in this world, that of the climate change, of the climate emergency. Sometimes perhaps we wonder that we are trying so hard to have everything for the whole world that we risk literally losing the life of the world in so doing. And then Jesus ends today, or rather the last thing he says in the passage we're looking at, when he says, if a person is ashamed of me and of my teaching in this godless and wicked day, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So do we see ourselves perhaps in our own journey of faith in our own, wrestling with these difficult questions, as perhaps denying Jesus or not, seeking to be as close to him as we might. So this passage that we looked at today during Lent. Lent is certainly a time for reflection, for prayer, and many would say for changing direction, for thinking about how we live and how we will live. It's a time for, I suppose, as a result of that, asking ourselves hard questions, and these questions that are posed by Jesus are surely among the hardest. But when we look behind the questions from our post-Easter perspective, when we see the promise in Jesus' words of the life that can be gained, true life through following him, then surely that must inspire us and give us true hope for our individual journeys of faith at this time, and indeed at all times, as we seek to follow him.